on the phone former New York State Assemblyman, director of the feature film Vote for Me, and author of War Against All Puerto Ricans, Revolution and Terror in America's Colony, Nelson Denis. Nelson, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So I got to say that, you know, as someone who in the 70s, as a kid, I would hear about Puerto Rican nationalists, and I knew, I frankly, I think growing up, I never heard anything else about Puerto Rico or nationalist movement that much, and occasionally in the news we would hear something about statehood, but the history that you lay out of Puerto Rico it's both stunning history, and it's sort of stunning to me that I never even sort of like casually bumped into this in the course of my life. It's fascinating stuff. Let's start with how it was that the United States of America came to essentially own Puerto Rico.
Great question, because that's really the root of everything, and it's what preordains the things that you hear about as to what's going on in Puerto Rico. It starts in 1898, immediately after the Spanish-American War. The very next year, there was this devastating Hurricane San Ciriaco, which destroyed the entire island's coffee crop, left tens of thousands of people homeless. It essentially ruined the Puerto Rican economy, flattened it. The United States didn't send any kind of relief. Instead, the following year, they devalued the Puerto Rican currency by 40% and forced everyone to exchange their currency for American dollars at a devalued 40% rate. So you have a hurricane, 40% currency devaluation, and then the following year, 1901, the United States enacted the Hollander Act, which presented a steeply graduated set of property taxes that no farmer had ever faced before. Now you have these three things that hit all at once. Well, logically, farmers they need capital. They're looking anywhere they can and not lose their farms. Well, the main source of lending was it was called the American Colonial Bank, but there was no usury loan restriction. So to just meeting the interest payments, if you take the mortgage crisis of 2007 and multiply it 100-fold, then you get a sense of what was happening in Puerto Rico within 3 years of the relationship. So the net result was this: within 20 years, the farmers overwhelmingly had lost their farms. 80% of the most arable land in Puerto Rico was owned by North American banking syndicates, and almost half of it was owned by just four what was called centrales, sugarcane centrales, and those four owned over half of all the arable land. And so it was a radical divestiture of property that happened within 20 or 30 years. These former farmers then went to look for work. They migrated to the towns and the cities. But when the Puerto Rican legislature tried to enact any minimum wage legislation, it was struck down as unconstitutional. And the irony there is that in 1917, Puerto Ricans were declared citizens in time for military conscription into World War I. But in 1922, under Balzac v. Puerto Rico, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the Constitution did not apply in Puerto Rico. And so, therefore, things like freedom of speech and minimum wage legislation were not available privileges and immunities.
All right, I want to get to. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because I want to stay because I mean that history in and of itself is also sort of just stunning to me. But I want to stay at first at the sort of the nascent relationship there. Now, you write, and I mean I think it's obvious. It's well-known history to some degree that in 1897, Spain had granted Puerto Rico a charter of autonomy. And so when this was, which essentially set up, or at least gave Puerto Rico the right to create its own, political infrastructure and monetary system, et cetera, et cetera. So what happened as the U.S. ostensibly liberated Puerto Rico? I mean, how did that dynamic play out? I mean, just before that point where, and I want to talk about Charles Herbert Allen because I think having interviewed Perkins, the author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, we see that same dynamic sort of play out there at the beginning of the relationship, or that relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. But how did it, like, literally, once America wins, I guess, at that point, I mean, how does it, what is the expectation of the Puerto Rican people at that moment, and how is that slope, I guess, the slide down into what ultimately becomes?
That Charter of Autonomy, the Carta de Autonomía that you just mentioned, was a high point in Puerto Rican political and economic history, because it gave, for the one and only time in its history, because Puerto Rico had been a Spanish colony for nearly 4 centuries, it gave it tariffs and trade relations, its own disposition over that, import and export authority, coastal control, and the authority to develop its own shipping and maritime industry. It gave it all that. And then politically, it created a legislature which in Puerto Rico that could draft and promulgate its own laws, and also send 2 voting members to the Spanish Cortes, which is the Congress, and the Spanish Congress. It gave it all of that. It gave it a full participation. It didn't entirely break Puerto Rico off, but it gave it the highest measure of sovereignty that it's ever had before or since. It lasted all of 1 month, because under the Spanish-American War, which just broke out literally weeks after that, they abolished that system. And when the United States came in, they came in as liberators. The general was called Nelson Miles, and he comes into the town of Paulson, and he gives this big fancy proclamation about how we've come to give you the full measure of sovereignty and to bring you the blessings of enlightened civilization. Those are his words. But at the same time, you had senators like Albert Beveridge on the floor of the U.S. Senate saying that Puerto Ricans were savages given to cannibalism and headhunting. The prevailing sense of who was Puerto Rico, who were these people, was so narrowly circumscribed. They just considered, literally the language they used was savage and senile people. This is in the congressional record. So it laid a precursor for just going in and doing whatever the hell they wanted, and that's what they did. And that's what led to, as you said, the first civilian governor was Charles Herbert Allen, and I call him the man who stole Puerto Rico, because he was only there for 17 months. Wow. During that time, he just did an agricultural survey of what he conducted during those 17 months, rather than any governance, because he then immediately gave his first annual report to President McKinley as a governor, and then immediately resigned, went up to Wall Street, got himself installed as a vice president of Morgan Guaranty Trust, and within 10 years, he was first treasurer, then president, then a member of the board of directors of the American Sugar Refining Company, which at that point, but by doing this, what Charles Herbert Allen did, they acquired 98% penetration of the sugar refining capacity. They handled 98% of the sugar refining of the entire United States. That company today is known as Domino Sugar.
Wow.
What Charles Herbert Allen is he wired the entire Puerto Rican agricultural economy. He did agricultural studies on the soil, figured out the best places. He hired people into the Puerto Rican government bureaucracy, who then gave him railroad easements, tax abatement deals, land disposition, all the sort of the benefits that you get from being nicely well-connected politically, because he had appointed all these people into the Puerto Rican bureaucracy. So he had this, it was amazing. I mean,
this guy's like the original Robert Rubin in a way, right?
The original robber baron. He was the first economic hitman to go to, and he cased the joint and turned the entire island into a crime scene. He just put it all in his pocket. When people on Wall Street saw what you could accomplish in such an accelerated period of time, then there was a land rush, literally. And that's when you had these banking syndicates buying things up right and left. And it was like easy pickings because of what the shock that had been applied to Puerto Rico in those first 3 years. You could get all these distressed assets for pennies on the dollar, and that's happening actually today.
Right.
I don't know.
I know. I want to get into exactly what's happening today, because it is amazing how much of those early years are sort of reflected in what is going on today. But at the time that Allen is installed, and I guess presumably he is sort of the coalition provisional authority, of that day, I guess. You quote the New York Times writing at that time, it would be much better for her, Puerto Rico, to come at once under the beneficent sway of the United States than to engage in doubtful experiments of self-government. What was it why Puerto Rico? In other words, the states at that point, I guess we did the same in some respects with Guam, I guess, but why? What was it that was of value even before you had a guy like Allen come in and say, like, oh, wow, there's a lot of opportunity here for me to sort of get the inside track on business from a national interest? What was the interest? Was it strategic? Was it in terms of resources? Was it simply both, and that there was the value of Puerto Rico, and then there was the sort of the opportunity of Puerto Rico? What was the sort of the mentality of, I guess, the establishment at that point as to why Puerto Rico was worth it?
That's a good question, because when what that bespeaks on your part is an understanding that there's a cognitive process. You don't understand the value of the land itself, and that you've actually stumbled onto these riches until you get there, which is what Allen realized. But your question is very astute, because you're saying, well, even before then, what is it? What got us to that point? And that's a perfect question. If you look at the map, you just look at the Caribbean basin there, you'll see that Puerto Rico is there's a few tiny little ones, but the first real major landmass that any westward, i.e. from Europe, from Africa, ship will encounter will be Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is the first major place that if it allows you then, it's a very significant geopolitically, because it becomes a coaling station. Ships, like jet planes, they have to be refueled. At that point, if you remember, at that point we were getting into our Industrial Revolution. It wasn't sailing; we had steamer boats at that point, and they were running on coal. So Puerto Rico was initially seen as a very valid, and it was written up that way in the New York Times, and also in congressional testimony, and in U.S. Navy documents, as a very important from a naval perspective for United States shipping, one, to control shipping lanes, and two, to basically extend that Monroe Doctrine that was developing in the United States, that sense of the United States was beginning to flex its muscles internationally. And one of the first ways of doing that was to have a very important outpost in the Atlantic Ocean, and Puerto Rico was it. And that was the initial interest.
You could effectively control the Caribbean Sea basically from Puerto Rico, because to your sort of, I guess, your northwest, you have Florida, and then you have a series of these smaller islands. Okay, and then they find out, oh, there's also some other benefits here. This isn't just going to be a base for us. This is going to be a sort of a constant source of resources for us to exploit.
Yeah, it became the gift that keeps on giving, and when they realized that, there was no way they were going to give it up.
And so you've got this Allen who just comes in and just, it really does feel like he just sees this is just an unbelievable opportunity that he completely dominates, bringing us domino sugar, I guess. Tell us essentially what happens with Pedro Campos? Because this is sort of the pushback, right? I mean, he is. Tell us who he was.
Yeah, and there's some specific moments where the story of Pedro Albizu Campos is the story of Puerto Rico. It's almost like he had to have existed because he was an inevitability. But he's the man that embodied all his historical dynamics. He's a brilliant fellow. He spoke 6 languages. He was the first Puerto Rican to graduate from Harvard and Harvard Law School, and he was offered all sorts of corporate sinecures and a judgeship and clerkships, and he turned all of that away to go down to back to his hometown of Ponce, Puerto Rico, and essentially practice poverty law. He was just representing poor people that needed it. Because he wanted to build his reputation as a man that could be trusted and a man that was basically aligned with his people rather than the power structure. And it really was. There were only really 2 ways to go, because there was the American English-speaking structure, and then there was the Puerto Ricans, the Puerto Rican masses. There wasn't really a very large middle class at the time. So he makes that choice, and within not much time, he becomes the president of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, starts advocating, editorializing, organizing, everywhere he can on behalf of the independence of Puerto Rico. The United States simply ignores him. I mean, tolerates him. Some people know him, but at that time, Puerto Rico was separated from the United States by an ocean, a language, a culture, 400 years of Ibero-American history, and technology. If you think back 20s, 30s, 40s, there was certainly no internet, no television, a little bit of radio, but it really didn't emanate from Puerto Rico northward. The only information that was coming off was some occasional print, and that was in the hands of, say, half a dozen wire service reporters, AP and UPI personnel, who basically regurgitated some prepackaged news, and they just sent it. And it was a pretty easy job, if you think about it, living in Puerto Rico and just filing some simple stories. But what it meant is that information wouldn't really leave the island, and when it would be radically misreported. So Puerto Rico was on its own. And so what was happening down there, or what was along the lines of, you hear the slogan, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, what happened in Puerto Rico never happened at all. And you could literally get away with murder. So he, as a leader of the Nationalist Party, would realize that he was really fighting against an empire, but it was also in the wilderness. Right. He finally came to the understanding that, we're going to have to take hands into ourselves, because we don't have any responsiveness in Washington. The American public is blithely and continually unaware of what's going on here, and it's even unfair to expect the American people to know, because how can they? They're not getting any information. So it all finally came to a point where they were declared U.S. citizens in time to fight for World War I, but not U.S. citizens with respect to having any real constitutional privileges and immunities, such as minimum wage. They started organizing naturally into unions. They had a strike, and the United States was dealing with it very forcefully. I mean, sending in guards and breaking people up. They go to Albizu Campos because he was deemed as the most trusted man on the island, but also who had some smarts about him. And they asked him to lead this island-wide agricultural strike, and he did, and he succeeded. It was the first time that Puerto Rico really galvanized itself. They essentially shut down the sugarcane economy for a period of 4 or 5 months. They won that strike. It doubled the sugarcane wages from 75 cents a day to $1.50. So there was 15 cents an hour for a 10-hour workday. That was. But at that point, and this was in the depths of the Depression, this was 1934, 35, that meant the difference between starving and not for a lot of those people's families. So for this was a stunning victory, and the United States then immediately, for the first time, took notice of Pedro Albizu Campos, and they acted swiftly and severely. They sent down a new governor who was a general, an army general named Blanton Winship. They sent down a new police chief named E. Francis Riggs to totally militarize the Puerto Rican police force, and they started sending down FBI agents, and they created something called the Carpetas program, which are secret FBI files that over a period of 6 decades ended up having over 100,000 Puerto Ricans were subject to the secret surveillance. So they reacted immediately. And E. Francis Riggs, the chief of police, interesting man, his father was the owner of the Riggs National Bank, which was the largest bank in Washington, D.C. at the time. And the Riggs Bank was known for providing financing to fake revolutions that were actually disguised right-wing takeovers all over South and Central America. They were basically one of the basic political financing arms for the United Fruit Company. So, and they did a tremendous amount of money laundering, and they finally got shut down, this bank. They got caught money laundering for the dictator Agustin Pinochet in Chile. So the son of the scion, the heir to the Riggs fortune, E. Francis Riggs, is the police chief of Puerto Rico. He's actually a colonial overseer overseeing the United States investments. Well, violence started immediately. They started chasing, harassing, and shooting nationalists around Puerto Rico. And one time there was something that became known as the Rio Piedras massacre in the town of Rio Piedras. They shot 3 nationalists and a poor fellow buying a lottery ticket in broad daylight. And he held, Riggs, a press conference, convened the press, called them to him so that he could utter these words. He said that if Albizu Campos and the nationalists continued to instigate the sugarcane workers and the university students, there would be war to the death against all Puerto Ricans. Those were his words as police chief representing the United States, that he tells it to the entire island press. And that became the title of my book, because that is actually exactly what was being conducted. Wow. Only a year later, the war is very simple. It says, you're going to do what we're telling you. We're coming here. It's a sugarcane economy. We own the land. If you don't like it, we're going to shoot you. That's what he's saying. And he delivered on that. A year later, in a group of people on Palm Sunday waving their palm fronds, an unarmed group of about 200 or 300 Puerto Ricans were marching in Ponce, which is Albizu Campos' hometown, in support of Albizu Campos, because by that time they had put him in jail. And what the police did, they created a firing zone with Tommy gunners. These are the guys that were militarized by Police Chief Riggs. And they shot and killed 17 Puerto Ricans in broad daylight on Palm Sunday and wounded over 200 more in what was known as the Ponce massacre, because it was in the town of Ponce.
Now, I imagine at that time, when something like that happens, the entire island is aware of it in moments. I mean, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but when you're trying to teach, it seems to me it would be quite easy to basically say, to get the word across the island that, like, look, this is the way it's going to work here. You're basically on some version of a plantation. But let me ask you just one more question. Okay, so in 1922, just going back a little bit, the case Balzac v. Puerto Rico says that the United States Constitution does not apply to Puerto Ricans. When is that? When is that reversed? And B, is that what allowed for Public Law 53 in 1948, which is it's just stunning to me that a couple of years after World War II ostensibly fought for the American freedoms, et cetera, that this Public Law 53 gets instituted in Puerto Rico. Were they able to institute that law because Balzac had yet been reversed in some fashion?
Well, they were able to institute that because the United States can do whatever it wants from the beginning. So, yeah, the Balzac and what's also known as the insular cases, because there's a set of them, there's 3 or 4 major cases, set the legal groundwork. But you don't really need it because they were pretty much doing what they wanted anyway, legal or illegal.
Tell people what Public Law 53 was.
Public Law 53, I mean, it's so blatant. It was modeled after the U.S. Anti-Communist Smith Act, and the language is actually almost identical, except its application in Puerto Rico was perverse because there was no Soviet menace in Puerto Rico. I mean, So under the language of Public Law 53, it became a felony, punishable by 10 years in jail, to utter a word, sing a song, whistle a tune, or express anything against the United States. And the local authorities would have complete discretion as to what constitutes a qualifying expression of dissent. So if you just simply say the U.S. sucks, that could land you for 10 years in jail.
Wow.
But even further than that, if you owned, not displayed out in the street, but owned in your own home, in a shoebox, in your closet, hidden from view, you could have a Puerto Rican flag the size of a postage stamp, and the mere ownership of a Puerto Rican flag in your own home could subject you to the police coming in, breaking down your door, finding the flag, or planting it, as happened in some cases, and then subjecting you to 10 years in prison as a felon for a violation of Public Law 53. It was enacted just a few months after Pedro Albizu Campos returned after 10 years in jail to the island. So this law was written specifically with the political intent of shutting up Albizu Campos and the nationalists. That was the purpose of the law. So they abrogated the rights, the First Amendment rights of 2 million Puerto Ricans in order to shut one man up. This gives you an idea of how nakedly they rolled, and they did apply it. They arrested hundreds of Puerto Ricans under this act all over the time, all over the place. And when there was finally the revolution occurred in 1950, that's the main subject matter of my book. They arrested 3,000 Puerto Ricans within the space of a week under Public Law 53. And I'll get one final deeper irony is that it was passed in 1948, just after, as I said, after Albizu Campos came back from jail. Well, George Orwell published his book, 1984, in the year 48 and 49. It was a big hit in the United States and England. The book, 1984, was a bestseller about totalitarian government and Big Brother is watching you and everything that constitutes 1984. It was a bestseller at the same time that George Orwell was alive and well in Puerto Rico, and an Orwellian existence was imposed on that entire island at the same time that people are reading 1984 up here. So that's how odd things were in Puerto Rico at the time.
So the attempted, I guess, revolution in 1950 ends up with the arrest of 3,000 Puerto Ricans. What happens to the I guess the nationalist impetus or the nationalist desire at that point? Because it seems to me that I just remember this as a kid in the 70s. There was talk that we were going to see Puerto Rican statehood, and then it just sort of melted away. Like that Puerto Rico is stuck in this sort of neither here nor there sort of state of being.
Yeah, it is. It's a dysfunctional relationship, and it only gets addressed and gets any congressional consideration when it becomes a really big, visible problem. And it's gonna continue that way because it's just a natural dynamic. It's out of sight, out of mind. That's unfortunate, but that's just Puerto Rico is a small island, 1,500 miles away from Washington and New York, and only when these problems, which then turn into opportunities, arise, like right now, the $73 billion of
let's talk about
the
this.
Looming bankruptcy, all of that is when Puerto Rico's on the radar. And as you know, once that gets resolved in one way or another, Puerto Rico will then recede into that distant horizon because, understandably, the United States, we barely know what our next door neighbor is doing these days, right? Let alone get involved in it, and modern life is increasingly hermetically sealed. We have our technology, our cell phones, our computers, and everything. We're more and more isolated. So how you can't expect the United States it's not really well suited to be involved, let alone administering the affairs of what should be a sovereign nation 1,500 1,500 miles away. It doesn't work. And what they did to Albizu Campos, though, to make sure, though, to not allow the island to develop, for the moment he led that agricultural strike, which was in 1935, they had him in jail within 1 year on charges of seditious conspiracy against the United States. That's 1936. He died in 1965. That's 29 years. 25 of those 29 years he spent in jail. And the other 4 years he was surrounded round the clock, 24 hours a day, by a platoon of FBI agents. It was between 30 and 40 FBI agents in rotation, so that at any given time there would be 5 or 6 FBI agents following him everywhere he went and interrogating whoever he spoke to. That is how the United States wanted to guarantee that isolation of Puerto Rico 1,000 miles away would continue.
Right.
And so we're at the point now where it just doesn't work anymore. It's so dysfunctional that it's not even economically feasible.
Well, there's two things. I mean, one, give us a sense of what's happening in the politics within Puerto Rico, and how does this what we're seeing now play out? Because the governor of Puerto Rico has basically said, look, this is just a math problem. We cannot pay the $73 billion in debt. And simultaneously, you have, and they want to go into bankruptcy, which is available to municipalities, but not into, well, what I guess commonwealths. And part of the reason why there's a fight to not allow them into bankruptcy is because there's a concern by bondholders that big hedge funds, essentially, that they're going to have to take a haircut. Is that basically what's going on? Yeah.
And the root of it is the fact that, and part of the governor's speech was that Puerto Rico is, the problem with the debt is that it can't internally generate the revenue stream to service it. And that's the key operative language, that Puerto Rico in its current iteration does not have the financial and industrial tools to develop its own economy and its own prosperity under any circumstances, even when they renegotiate. I'm assuming that they will renegotiate and reconfigure this debt. And it goes back to the relationship. And
is that because basically you've got people in the United States going in there, controlling the resources and paying their taxes to the extent that they're paying them somewhere else, and so Puerto Rico has no ability to sort of even share in its own prosperity.
Right. Give you an example, the best one. Puerto Rico is an island, so by definition, it imports. It has to take in its goods. It's an island. Well, Puerto Rico is specifically prohibited from developing and operating its own shipping industry. Think about that. That's a foundation industry under the Jones Act. It's Section 27 of the 1920 Merchant Marine Act, which is also known as the Jones Act. It's called the Cabotage Law. Puerto Rico is not does not have the authority to have its own fleet, its own ships, and all the products that come in, meaning just about everything, has to come in on American flagships that were built in the United States, owned and operated by United States country nationals, and any product that comes from anywhere in the world has to be offloaded off the original foreign ship. That's the equivalent of digging a ditch and filling it up again. So if you have cars from Germany or Japan, finished goods from Europe, medicine from Canada, food from South America, all of it gets taken to Jacksonville. What happens in Jacksonville, Florida, it has to be offloaded off the original boat and then reloaded onto an American boat before it's allowed to come into Puerto Rico. That's completely dysfunctional. That's like a mafia protection racket. Right. But it's been in place for 95 years. And that alone, if Puerto Rico were allowed to have its own shipping, the revenue and the jobs that would be created for that would far exceed the amount of the current public debt of $73 billion from that alone. But it's not going to happen. Very simple, because the unions in Jacksonville, Florida, will lobby all their Democratic congressmen, and the four Jones Act carrier companies, there's four shipping companies, they will lobby, in other words, management, they will lobby their Republican congressmen. So you will have a coordinated knot of concentrated political figures in Washington that will oppose any meaningful Jones Act reform at any point. And under Citizens United, the FCC, all sorts of money are going to flow towards those congressmen to make sure that it happens. So you see how, it's a dysfunctional situation. There are some key, obvious, organic, morally correct solutions to this thing, but Puerto Rico is specifically prohibited from doing them. So, of course, if you don't allow people to be self-sustaining, if you took away somebody's legs and replace it by a series of crutches, you can't expect them to run the race. And so that's where we're at. And so Puerto Rico doesn't get naturally when you see the end result, people will say, oh, well, these people are lazy. They take food stamps. The hell with them. Make them pay that debt. What they don't realize is that you have completely incapacitated them and separated them from their ability to defend for themselves, because you've given all the franchises and concessions to these foreign investors. And they're the ones that are going to benefit. I'll give you one further example.
Please.
Right now, Puerto Ricans are paying, the water rates have gone up 60% in the last 10 years. They're paying 31 cents per kilowatt, which is twice what you pay in the United States for electricity. Property taxes have gone up over 25% in the last 15 years. Today, July 1st, they just instituted an 11.5% sales tax. Puerto Rico, in order to service this looming public debt, has been raising taxes everywhere they can. So much so that last year alone, 140,000 Puerto Ricans left the island. There is a reverse migration going on now. But at the same time, there's a law called Act 22, which created a 20-year complete tax abatement for interest, dividend, and capital gains profits from any high net worth investors that come from the United States and invest in Puerto Rican
That's unbelievable.
businesses.
That's unbelievable. So these guys come down there, they create basically their hotels or whatever it is. They pay no taxes on it whatsoever. To the extent that it has any implications on property taxes, it just raises property taxes on people who have no means in which to make any income or create any revenue for themselves. And then they go ahead and raise the sales tax, which is incredibly regressive. And I imagine most of those people who go down as tourists don't have to pay it.
That's right, and it's regressive, as you said. The small average guy is the one that's getting taxed to death, and then they have this double-sided tax system that benefits the foreign investor, like John Paulson, the leading guy that's benefiting from this from the United States. John Paulson is his hedge fund billionaire who profited. His hedge fund made $15 billion in the year 2007. The profits were $15 billion, betting against the American economy, basically profiting when people lost their homes. Well, that sort of predatory capitalism is what's now being imported into Puerto Rico, because there's all sorts of distressed assets that he's able to pick up. Right now, he's coordinated all these lots from people that lost their homes and their small businesses. He's building a $500 million resort and condominium complex on Dorado Beach. That's not, and the money, any profits from that are going to be repatriated back to the United States. So you see, that's not economic development. And so what we'll always have is this short-term tax preference deals that the money, the profits leave the island, and they create no real local infrastructure, such as the shipping, which is where you should start. So at the end of it, though, then the island gets blamed when it can't be self-sufficient and it can't meet its public debt. But they have given them no other means for meeting that debt other than borrowing. And so that's why we have, as I said, it's a dysfunctional relationship. And the opportunity of it, though, is that I think hopefully people will realize it and say, you know what, this is even working for us. It's not working for the American taxpayer. What hopefully happens is that we realize that it's a bunch of rich people and one percenters, if you'll pardon, that are benefiting from this relationship. It's the same thing that people that occupy Wall Street or people complain about. So it's a way that rich people figure out ways to make money for each other. And they're doing it in Puerto Rico. And it's basically the same evisceration of the middle class that's happening down there that's going on up here. When people wake up to that and realize that there's a collective self-interest in eliminating that, then there'll be some meaningful reform. Until then, you know what's going to happen? These bonds, they're not going to be paid because the money's not there. So hopefully that is what's going to instigate some reform.
Nelson Denis, the book is War Against All Puerto Ricans, Revolution and Terror in America's Colony. We'll put a link to it at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today.
A real pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.